Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another great episode of CRMprov. I'm your host, Mickey Baines. If you aren't familiar with the show, CRMprov is the go-to podcast for higher education CRM. We don't just cover technology, we dive deeply into all aspects of strategies and tactics that folks in higher ed need to deploy so that they can then produce the outcomes they need. With me today, Kirsten Lum, the founder and CTO, Chief Technology Officer at storytellers.ai. Kirsten is also a senior ex-Amazon machine learning and economics leader. I can't wait to unpack what that is. And a lecturer at the University of Washington. Kirsten, welcome to CRMprov. I'm really excited to have you here and ready to dive in, really for the first time on the show, to talk about AI. It's hard to believe this is season 3, and this is the first time we've really diving in deep into it. So I want to connect a little bit and talk a little bit about, in terms of AI, where we were, where we are, where we're headed. But before we get there, why don't you tell us a little bit about storytellers.ai?
I'd be happy to. Thank you for having me on. Storytellers is the company that we started based on this realization that AI and machine learning are techniques that have grown very large organizations very quickly. You think about the Googles, the Amazons, Microsoft, all of these large companies have large data science teams that are using AI and ML to grow their organization. And we saw this need for those same techniques to be used in smaller to mid-sized companies, but that there are way too many barriers for those companies to even get their feet wet in using these technologies. So about 4 years ago, almost now, we started the company with that mission. Let's bring these ML and AI techniques that large organizations use to grow and manage their businesses to higher education, local government, small business, and lots of other types of organizations that traditionally are underserved.
And higher ed is one of those industries and one that really needs this.
Yes.
So before we get into the higher ed piece, let's talk about AI. Where we really are today. I know there's a lot of buzz since OpenAI dropped out the ChatGPT functionality. Everyone has followed suit and it's created a lot of buzz. But when I think AI, I know we're talking content creation, all the fun little things like that. But when I think AI, I really think predictions and being able to be predictive with what we do. To some extent, I say that's the future, but with your company, that's really not the future. That's today. So am I wrong? Is predictive really where we should be focused, or where we're going to see the most growth coming from AI?
I think you're right on. In terms of where I've seen AI and machine learning actually make a difference in an organization, far and away the number one place is with predictive machine learning. And that's the science of saying, let's take your historical data about the events and attributes that are important to you, and let's see if we can predict those before they happen. For example, one example that's very common in business would be like customer churn. That's a question that's on almost every business's mind. We've worked so hard to get this customer to be one of our customers. Now, which of those are unlikely to continue being our customers? And is there anything, therefore, that we can do to try and retain them more? And that same concept can apply to all kinds of organizations. Talking higher education, there's lots of parts of the student life cycle or the instructor life cycle or any other life cycle where you'd say, if I just knew this ahead of time, I would do something different. But, and that's the tool. The predictive machine learning is the tool that's used to basically see the future that way.
So in the world of predictions, if I dive in a little bit here to higher ed, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the barriers, because the first barrier that comes to my mind is going to be the data. How clean is our data? Do we have enough data? Is that a barrier that you see? Is it a real barrier? And how do we solve for it if it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that is definitely the first barrier that people usually hit. And one of the first things that, like, for instance, we'll look at for an organization to judge readiness for using some of these techniques is, how long have you had a policy of collecting data about the events and the things that you want to make predictions about? So if there's a world where you've never started collecting data about your admissions funnel of here's where someone came in, and then here's all the steps they went through, and here's when they became a student. If you haven't been collecting data about that, then AI is not really going to help you there, because AI is looking at historical data in order to make its decisions about the future. But even in a world where you have been collecting data, there's this discipline of like, am I storing that all in a location where I can access it? Is it locked away in my SaaS platform, or have I gone ahead and pulled that into my own environment to where I can access it and actually manipulate it? And then two, have I looked at that and judged whether like, yeah, this is actually capturing data well, or nope, our system is broken in some way and we're actually getting a bunch of garbage in this, data. And those two things are, I think, a barrier that feels insurmountable to organizations that haven't yet built a data muscle. Some organizations have an analytics function, and like that's like, yeah, we've already done that. We did that 5 years ago, and now we've got this data store. And those are the ones that we see are just like, okay, you should be using ML. Like if you're doing analytics, you should be able to do ML. Like ML is at least something that you should try on your data. If you don't have an analytics group, that's where the barrier is a little higher. But the good news is with cloud computing, that barrier is still way lower than it was, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you would need to do like a 2-year-long digital transformation project, and it would just be like pulling teeth to get people to engage. But now with cloud computing, you can choose a cloud provider like AWS, like Google Cloud, and actually getting data into there is a much easier like prospect than it was before. So I would say that's honestly one of the things we help with too, is like if your data is locked away in your SaaS products or your systems, getting that data into a cloud data warehouse should be a matter of like months, not years. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, my mind's spinning with several questions. So, we were talking before we recorded, and I'm not good with like scripts and staying on task. So just trying to remember each question and not losing is a really hard thing for me.
Right.
So one of the things in my world where I'm helping schools sometimes select, but very often implement a CRM, their CRM's got a lot of functionality to it. It can do a lot of things. Not every school is ready to do all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of have to help them implement to scale. And so when I think about machine learning, I think about predictions. And you were talking about having data, not having data. A lot of schools are in the middle. They've got some data, but not all the data that they want, where they're tracking maybe consistently certain things, but not a lot of other things. Is there a path for scaling to start with something small and to grow into that? Or must I have everything up front before I can really get some good predictions out of it?
I have found that the barest minimum is that as long as you're collecting and have access to the thing you want to predict, so you imagine that might be my application to start. I want to predict of my applicants, which ones are actually going to start at my university. As long as you're collecting your application events and your start events, that is where I actually encourage people to start trying machine learning. And there's two reasons for that. It's like either one, you get a success and like, wow, great, let's start using it. You get the benefit right away. Or you actually can then understand, is it likely that the reason I'm not successful with building this application is because I don't have enough data? That's something that a data scientist can know. So you go in, you build the model, and like ideally, and in fact, this is, I would say, more often than not, when I'm in this scenario, people are surprised by how few data sources they need to start using the machine learning model. It can always get better, to your point, like more data is often going to improve this performance, but like just to get started, because there's all the implementation stuff we can talk about after. Like there's still a long road. After you train a model, there's still a long road to like implementing it and using it. And you can get started on that path where you start collecting other data. But two, then again, you can barely get a much better sense of like, what is it I should be collecting? If it doesn't work, where is it likely that I should point my resources to be able to collect some more data to get a better model?
So now you've got me other questions. Now I've got to prioritize and get them in the right order. Well, this was my next question, so we might have to jump back and forth. But before I forget it, you talked a little bit about data warehouse. We've got some people are going to know what these are, some people won't. But let's say we've got data warehouses. We also have something called data lakes, where if you don't understand the difference, think of a warehouse. Kirsten's an ex-Amazonian, so let's think what an Amazon warehouse may look like, and then just think about what's in a lake, how it's randomized. Do you need a warehouse? Can you use a lake? Do you need a central place for all of this data to live to start pulling from, or with your platform, are you pulling from multiple sources?
Yeah, good question. So I'll talk first about kind of what the setup usually needs to be if people were going to do this in-house, and then why we kind of set up our product the way that we did, because there's some pain there.
Yes.
So in terms of data lake, data warehouse, data warehouse is really specifically for data that you could visualize being inside a spreadsheet. So if you can visualize your data as spreadsheets, that's a good use case for data warehouse. Data lake is really helpful where when you think about your data, are you thinking about documents? Are you thinking about videos? Are you thinking about, if you're familiar, like JSON? It's not in a spreadsheet. It's like text, or code or whatever it is. That's a good use case for a data lake. It's like we want a place to put all this stuff, but it doesn't all fit into the spreadsheets that data warehouse requires. Yes. And the reality is that for predictive, the models that are the best at doing predictive ML require the data to be tabular or in these spreadsheet formats. And the good news is that data warehouses are a little easier to build and maintain than data lakes. Data lakes is really like if you're doing all kinds of interesting things with content or whatever, that you need a data lake. But data warehouse is a good starting point. And it also is the starting point for a lot of the predictive models that we see performing the best. It does need to be centralized eventually. So when you go to build your model, that model needs to have copies of the data from wherever it lives. So if you have 4 data warehouses, you eventually need to get it into one place so that model can access it. So I generally recommend, especially if people are starting out, to think about a centralized data warehouse, because eventually you're going to need to pull that data together anyway. Might as well do it at the beginning and save yourself some time. But as you can imagine, all of that, there's difficulty along that whole journey, right? Like standing up your warehouse and then getting it from all your sources and storing it into these tables. That's a ton of work sometimes. And so because we know that's a reality for these organizations, they haven't centralized their data into a data warehouse. We build our platform such that we can do that last mile of pulling things together before training. We just get it from all your sources and figure out how they fit together. That's actually, I'll double click on that just a little bit. When I talk about how the data fits together, that I imagine as a CRM, you're talking CRM, schema, cross-system schemas, or understanding if each system, like a CRM or your website data or all of your admission system data, each of those are an independent puzzle. So there's all kinds of data in each one of those systems. And then you've got another puzzle, which is how do all of those puzzles fit together? So it's like 2 levels of puzzles. And that's when I talk about centralizing data, that's one of the biggest hurdles, is not only do you have to get it into a spot, but you have to figure out how all those puzzles fit together into one bigger puzzle. And that's what our technology does. Instead of our clients having to like figure out, okay, let me pull all my data together, figure out how Salesforce joins to my HubSpot or whatever else I'm using. Our platform does all of that for them. And we figure out that whole puzzle, and then we build models from there.
So when we think about that's to me, I have a good, you put the puzzle together for me. Let's put it that way. If you can put it together for me, then I know everybody else has a puzzle put together. So data, quantity, consistency, cleanliness, one barrier. What are some of the other barriers you might see specifically college universities struggle with when they come to you and say, hey, we need help?
Yeah. The very next one is, what should we build? That is a huge barrier.
Yes.
You can imagine if someone tells you, like, I have a magic wand, so to speak, that could predict anything you want. Like, what is it you want to predict? And then it's just like blank, right? Like people don't know. And then also they maybe haven't thought through. There's things that you might initially think are the most important thing to predict, but then there's all kinds of things that you realize later, like, oh, even though I predicted that, there's all this other stuff I need to predict in order to really make use of it. So there's this quote that we've started using in a bunch of our like pitch decks and things, which is like, machine learning is not a silver bullet, but it is silver buckshot. It is like a really unique tool, but its power really comes from being used in like a suite of predictions that you're making together. So, for example, and this is kind of answering that question, like, what should we build? The very first thing that I usually start with is, where is your major decisions in your pipeline or in your funnel where you would be able to make a different decision if you had information ahead of time? So for example, the example that I like to use for higher education is this applicant to start, or, lead to applicant, these places where like we're trying to get someone down this funnel. And if we knew ahead of time that they were going to struggle, we might make a different decision. We might allocate more resources to reach out to them. But imagine that's where you start to get into this, the buckshot sort of analogy is, yes, you've predicted this applicant is going to start, and it's like uncertain. They're not super likely. They're not super unlikely. Then your very next question is, okay, what should I do? And that's where you can also predict things like, okay, I've got a call center. What time could I call them that's most likely to result in them picking up? Or are they going to pick up the phone at all? Like, if they're not going to pick up the phone, don't waste your resources, because that's expensive to waste so much resources calling them if they're just not going to pick up the phone. But you might predict, are they going to open an email? Are they going to respond to a text message? Like, all of these predictions, you can make all of these predictions together and then use them in concert to say, all right, here's my person that's unlikely to make it through this funnel on their own. And here's where I should reach out to them. And here's when I should reach out to them. And when you start to see it in concert, you get a much bigger impact on your outcome metric than just using one model by itself.
A great analogy. Love the buckshot, because we get asked, or I not necessarily asked directly, but you can tell by the questions are asked that people often are looking for the silver bullet.
Mm-hmm.
And our general response is, that doesn't exist. It doesn't matter if it's in the data, if it's just in marketing or recruitment, whatever it is, growing enrollment. There's not a silver bullet. That does not exist, not a single thing. But the way you describe that, it starts to understand, because you start with one and then the others start to evolve and come to light from that. So all excellent things. So let's talk about some of the things we talked a little bit about application, who's likely, who's not. What are some of the key questions, maybe that higher level starting question that you see clients jumping to, or you find most interesting even with your clients? Where do you, what's some of those questions that as storytellers that you're starting to ask and answer?
Yeah, I tend to focus on a different functional group I'll approach a little bit differently. And I have this the way that I tend to approach is to try and find the organizational ontology, like how they are organizing themselves. That seems to there seems to be rhymes from organization to organization, which helps us with scale, and also helps us to get them a little bit ahead of, like, they don't have to start from scratch every time. We've got this like idea of a marketing organization tends to ask these questions, an admissions organization asks these questions, student services ask those questions. So I tend to break it down that way. And the questions that, sometimes there's overlap, which is really beneficial, but really there's this ontology of like, what are their important decisions that they're making as they move these various things down a funnel. So when we look at the like lead generation, where a lot of marketing dollars I think are spent in higher education, are like, how do I get people in the very top of my funnel and get them to the point where they've applied? That's kind of where we see the marketing organization. That's where we tend to have these questions about like, okay, which one of my leads are worth investing in? There's going to be a whole bunch of leads that just don't have any chance. They're really not actually interested. And so it doesn't make a ton of sense to invest in them. Or these ones are almost certainly going to apply. So make sure that they're warm, but don't overspend, because they're really interested. They're self-motivated. But there's this bucket in the middle where like additional effort may move them from a non-applicant to an applicant. And then you can imagine how it spider webs out from there, which is kind of the example that I gave before of like call centers or, emails and things like that. From the point of admissions onwards, so then talking about from admission to start, there's a whole bunch of things you can do around where you see pain points in your admissions funnel. Things like, what is the point at which most students fall off because it's really difficult to like submit the right document or get the right information, or there's an approval that is sometimes doesn't come through. Being able to anticipate that that applicant is going to hit a problem at that point, and not all applicants, right? Like there's
Yes.
the problem of like, if you did it for everyone, that's a ton of resources and a ton of attention that you're asking from these individuals. But if you can really pinpoint that and say, okay, this, 15% of my applicants are going to need help with this step, then you can really prioritize
Yes.
the resources and, help the students get through that step. And then there's all kinds of stuff once the students are into the organization, into the higher education institution. There's this is where maybe I feel the most passion about it. Like, it's so interesting, and so it feels so directly connected to how these organizations are trying to serve students around, is this student going to graduate? Like, imagine if you
Mhm.
knew that ahead of time. This student is going to struggle to graduate. And then around that, as we talk about this buckshot metaphor, what are the things that you would want to predict about that student that would help you to better get that student
Mm.
through to graduation? Is it because they're going to struggle financially? They're going to struggle academically? Like, what is it that is most likely to best support that student? All of those are predictions you can make as well. And then you can make just in time decisions to say, all right, if this student is unlikely to make it because of financial situations, let's get ahead of it. And maybe there's some merit-based scholarships or, other things that we can do to help that student. Or if it's academic, let's just really try to get the student into our tutoring program so they know that they're going to be supported with tutoring as they go through their academic journey. So and then
Yeah.
you can think about all the functions. You think about like, which of my instructors are most likely to leave, or those kinds of things. You can actually branch out from students into all of these funnels that are
That
in your organization, predicting those events ahead of time.
and to me, that's the new use case that we haven't even begun to dive in this industry in terms of higher education. Again, my mind's going here. For years there have been, and I'm not trying to throw any other company under the bus. The companies that have this model for tuition discounting or scholarship allocations to help identify and help schools build that class of new students. And what I see happening, just using that as a reference point, because you started asking other things, what about when they're enrolled? Should we consider something else? There's other components to it. What if there's a financial risk, if for them being able to afford it? If there's an academic risk, if you've got this model at the front of the funnel that helps you in the building the class, and a company or tool or platform, and then there's other use cases popping up. And in those use cases that pop up, you've got other potential other platforms that you might be using. And in my world of CRM, you've got sometimes 4 or 5, 6 types of tools you're trying to plug together to have a functioning CRM to do what you want it to do. And I see there's a potential for having multiple predictive tools trying to do different things. And the advantage then being looking at a tool like yours where it's one tool that can do it all and give you the buckshot, because otherwise, instead of buckshot, you've got 45 BB guns back there with 45 different people trying to shoot. All right, that's the analogy that's coming to my mind. But we
Yeah.
went from silver bullet to silver buckshot. But that's really what we're talking about. And can you imagine the effectiveness of having 45 people with a BB gun versus one buckshot? I mean, that's there's a different way to get to that information. One's going to be more powerful, and more accurate. And that's what to me, I find being something that should be on our minds as we go down this path of AI for predictive purposes. I don't think you're going to disagree with me on that, but if you do, please feel free. You're not going to hurt my feelings.
I totally agree. And to your point, that's part of why we approached it this way. We knew this pain point, like, to actually get the benefit of ML, you need cross-system information. Like, even your system that's using the prediction of whether someone's going to graduate would use information from the time they were a lead, from the time they were an applicant. All that information that's in those separate systems is valuable to making this prediction about graduation. So if you've got your ML system just in, say, your enrollment system has like, ML that it's looking at its own data. It's missing all that context that you've gathered that's really valuable that happened all the way through the beginning of the admissions funnel. And so the idea that, and then to your point, if it's all spread out across your systems, then your implementation step, which is actually, I think, the hardest. Like, as hard as collecting data is, I think implementation is maybe the hardest step in the whole thing. That makes implementation that much harder, because then you have to learn 20 different systems to even get the prediction out
Correct.
and then start using it. And so if you've got one place where it's like, okay, this is all pushed to you in like one standard format, it's all integrated in your systems, and then you can use it from there. Like, we find that really helps organizations get to implementation faster.
And in my world of CRM, that's, the rubber meets the road. So we've got prediction. We know what's going to happen. We start to have our own, or even a predictive action plan of how to best follow up. And when I think about, having the data, one of the biggest holes from a CRM perspective we see is you might have the data to make a prediction, but you don't yet have enough data to predict the action plan, because we're not documenting or logging, so to speak, that action plan, because we haven't had a system, especially beyond admissions. We haven't had a system to put all of that information in. And so now we have systems to put that information in. We have to get to a point where we actually are putting it in and putting it in consistently. And now you've got data that can understand the actions that you've taken when someone has hit one of those risk factors, and how to address and make that predictive. So, getting that together, I am generally my bias is, the fewer solutions, the better, because it can be one place, and it sounds like that resonates here in your world. Well, I think we could keep going for a long time, but I think this is a place to pause. Kirsten, this has really been really eye-opening, exciting, because, my mind starts to wonder. I'm really excited about this. And so I'm hopeful we can get back together at some point and continue this conversation. But for everyone out there watching, listening, thank you for that. Kirsten, if you want to find Kirsten online, you can find her on Twitter, or X as we call it now, at MACHSCI.
That's right.
For machine, what was it? Machine and science learning? Machine
and
learning
data
and science?
MACHSCI. Yes.
And data science. Yes. MACHSCI. MACHSCI. Is that how it's pronounced? You're
That's
really
how I
teaching
say
me.
it,
MACHSCI.
but
If you say it, I'm taking it. MACHSCI. Yes. So, Kirsten, thank you so much for joining me. Also, I didn't even say MACHSCI, or straight on the company website, storytellers.ai. You can find Kirsten as well as our colleagues there. Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us. Really valuable information. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to being back soon.
Yes. And everyone, thank you again for listening to another episode of CRMprov. We'll see you next time.